What if I told you that one of the biggest secrets in One Piece has been hiding in plain sight for over 1,000 chapters, and this mystery secretly connects Carrot, the Mink race, Zunesha, the ancient kingdom, the moon civilization that Enel discovered, and possibly even the final war of the entire series. Because when you really start looking at the story carefully, something about Carrot's ending in Wano suddenly doesn't make sense, and the longer you think about it, the stranger it becomes. Carrot suddenly becomes the ruler of Zou, even though she has absolutely no leadership experience, no royal bloodline, and has spent the entire story dreaming about adventure with the Straw Hats, while characters like Wanda and Shishilian are clearly far more qualified to lead the Mink Nation. Yet for some reason, the Dukes decide that the future of Zou should rest in the hands of a 15-year-old girl who never once showed any interest in ruling. At first, this moment felt like Oda simply writing Carrot out of the story. But what if the opposite is true? And what if the reason the Minks forced her to stay behind has nothing to do with leadership and everything to do with protection? Because there's a strange detail that most people forget. When Carrot secretly sneaks onto the Thousand Sunny during Zou, we later see Wanda interrogating the lookout monkey Mink, who was supposed to watch the harbor. And after some pressure, he finally admits that Carrot bribed him to stay quiet while she snuck away with the Straw Hats. And Wanda's reaction is extremely interesting, because instead of getting angry, she actually looks relieved, saying she is happy to finally know where Carrot went. That reaction only makes sense if the Minks were not worried about Carrot leaving. They were worried about who might find her, which raises a terrifying possibility. What if Carrot is not just another Mink? What if she is someone the world government might actually be looking for? Now, here is where things become even stranger. Carrot's entire story arc revolves around Pedro, the Mink warrior who sacrificed himself during Whole Cake Island so the Straw Hats could escape Big Mom's territory. And before his death, Pedro talks about the dawn of the world and how the Straw Hats will one day bring it. Pedro believed the Straw Hats would change history. He believed they would bring the dawn. And after he dies, it is very clear that Carrot inherits that will, because she is the one who watches his sacrifice and carries his dream forward. So logically, Carrot should continue traveling with the Straw Hats, exploring the world just like Pedro once did, seeing the dawn that he never lived long enough to witness. But instead, something strange happens. The story suddenly forces her to stay behind. And not just stay behind, she becomes the ruler of Zou, which completely contradicts everything Pedro wanted, unless the Minks had a reason to keep her there. And there is another detail that almost nobody talks about. Carrot fights using gauntlets. But during her flashback training with Shishilian, we see that she originally tried using a sword and was terrible at it, constantly getting knocked down while Shishilian yells at her, until Pedro suddenly steps in and tells him he will take over her training. And shortly after that, Pedro gives Carrot the gauntlets that become her signature weapon. Now think about that for a moment. No other Mink in the entire series uses gauntlets. Not Wanda, not Shishilian, not the Musketeers, no one. So where did Pedro get them? And how did he know Carrot would naturally be skilled with that specific weapon? Unless those gauntlets originally belonged to someone else. Someone connected to Carrot. Someone from the past. During Odin's flashback in Wano, we see a famous panel showing Odin Castle burning, while 3 commanders stand in front of the flames. But in a magazine special, Oda revealed something extremely interesting. That panel originally had 4 figures, not 3. One of them was removed before the final manga release. And when fans looked at the silhouette of that missing figure, they noticed something very strange. It appeared to have rabbit ears. And it appeared to be wearing gauntlets. At first, some fans jokingly suggested that Carrot was secretly a traitor who worked for Kaido. But that theory makes no sense, because that scene happened 20 years ago, and Carrot is only 15, meaning the rabbit figure cannot possibly be Carrot. But it could be someone else. Someone who looks like Carrot, someone who fights like Carrot, someone who might be connected to her, her mother. Imagine a rabbit mink pirate who left Zou over 20 years ago, similar to how Pedro once left to explore the world. But instead of returning safely, she eventually encountered Kaido and his beast pirates, a crew literally built around animal-themed warriors and zone powers, meaning Kaido would naturally be fascinated by a race of natural-born animal fighters like the Minks. Perhaps she fought. Perhaps she was defeated. Perhaps she was forced to join. But the story may not end there, because another force in the One Piece world hunts powerful individuals, the Celestial Dragons. We already know they capture slaves for entertainment. We know they held hunting tournaments like the one at God Valley. And considering they ruled the world for 800 years, it is extremely unlikely that God Valley was the only time they did this. So imagine this scenario. Carrot's mother is captured, and during that time, Carrot is born. But eventually something goes wrong. Maybe she rebels. Maybe she tries to escape. Maybe she fights to protect her child. And during one of the Celestial Dragon hunting festivals, she manages to break free, injured and desperate, carrying her baby across the seas until she finally reaches Zou. There she finds the Dukes, and before dying from her wounds, she gives them the child and makes them promise to protect her, hide her, and never let her enemies find her. Suddenly, everything starts making sense. Why the Minks panic when Carrot disappears. Why Wanda seemed relieved to know where she went. Why the Dukes refused to tell her the truth. Why they forced her to stay on Zou by making her queen. Because ruling Zou was never about leadership. It was about keeping her safe. But by doing that, they also took away her freedom. And the Minks have done something like this before. During the Jack invasion of Zou, they chained Raizo inside the whale tree and refused to tell him what was happening outside, because they believed they were protecting him from throwing his life away trying to help them. But in reality, they denied him the chance to fight beside them. They took away his choice, and now they may be doing the exact same thing to Carrot. Because Carrot's story might not just connect to Zou, it might connect to something much bigger. Something that explains the true history of the Mink race. Something that connects directly to the moon. And to understand that, we have to talk about one of the strangest locations in One Piece, Zou itself. A country that does not sit on an island. A country that lives on the back of a giant elephant. An elephant that has been walking across the seas for more than 1,000 years. An elephant named Zunesha. Now here is where the theory suddenly becomes much bigger than Carrot, because once you start looking at the history of the Minks themselves, you begin to notice something extremely strange. Something that Oda has quietly been hinting at for years without ever directly explaining it. The Minks are one of the most unusual races in the entire world of One Piece. Not just because they are humanoid animals, but because their greatest power does not come from training, weapons, or devil fruits, it comes from something else entirely: the moon. Whenever the full moon rises, the Minks transform into their most powerful form, known as Sulong, a state where their hair turns white, their eyes glow intensely, and their strength explodes to an almost uncontrollable level, making even ordinary Mink warriors capable of overwhelming powerful enemies. And when you look at that transformation carefully, it starts to resemble something we have seen somewhere else before: white hair, glowing eyes, an almost divine aura. Which is strangely similar to the appearance of Luffy's awakened Gear 5 form, the form representing the sun god, Nika. Now, at first, this might just seem like a visual coincidence, but the more pieces you connect, the harder it becomes to ignore the possibility that the Mink race may actually have a much deeper connection to ancient history than anyone realizes. Because the moon has already been connected to an ancient civilization in One Piece, and that connection comes from one of the strangest cover stories Oda has ever written. After the Skypiea arc, Enel does not disappear from the story like many villains normally do. Instead, Oda gives him an entire cover story showing what happens after he leaves the Sky Island and travels to the moon using the Arc Maxim. When Enel finally arrives there, he discovers something incredible. Ruins. An ancient city. A lost civilization. The city is called Birka, and inside those ruins, Enel finds an army of ancient robots known as the Automata. Machines that appear to have once served this long-vanished civilization. But there is one detail that makes this discovery extremely important. The city is powered by electricity. The entire system begins working again only when Enel uses his lightning abilities to reactivate the machines. Which means the civilization that once lived there relied heavily on electrical energy. Now think about that for a moment. If an entire ancient city ran on electricity, what kind of race would be extremely valuable to that civilization? A race that can naturally generate electrical energy. A race like the Minks. This raises a very disturbing possibility. What if the Minks originally came from the moon? What if the Birkan civilization used them as living power sources, forcing them to generate electro-energy to keep their machines running? Because we already know the Minks possess a natural ability called electro, an ability that allows them to channel electricity through their bodies without any devil fruit. And if an advanced civilization needed massive amounts of electricity to survive, then enslaving a race capable of naturally producing it would be incredibly valuable. But then something happened. Something that may have destroyed that entire system. And that event might be connected to the legend of Nika. Throughout One Piece, Nika is described as the sun god who brings freedom to slaves, a warrior who liberates people from oppression and tyranny. And when Luffy awakens his devil fruit, he literally becomes the embodiment of that legend. But what if the original Nika did more than just free slaves on Earth? What if the legend of Nika actually began somewhere else? Somewhere above the world. On the moon. Imagine a moment in ancient history when a powerful warrior appears and frees the Minks from slavery, destroying the system that kept them trapped as living batteries for the Birkan civilization. Suddenly, the moon civilization loses its primary energy source. Its machines shut down, its cities collapse, and the survivors are forced to abandon their home. If that happened, the Minks would have needed a new place to live. But where could an entire race of people go after fleeing a dying moon civilization? That answer might lead us directly to one of the most mysterious beings in the entire story, Zunesha. Zunesha is one of the strangest creatures we have ever seen in One Piece. An elephant so enormous that an entire civilization lives on its back. An elephant that has been walking through the ocean for over 1,000 years. An elephant that is supposedly being punished for a crime committed during the Void Century. But the more you think about Zunesha, the more questions start appearing. Why would the ancient kingdom punish an elephant by forcing it to walk endlessly across the sea? Why would an animal even understand punishment in the first place? And why does Zunesha obey people who can hear the voice of all things, specifically Joy Boy in the past and Luffy in the present? The answer might be that Zunesha was never just an animal. Zunesha might have been part of a much larger plan. Because if the Minks were refugees from the moon, the ancient kingdom might have needed a way to protect them from the world that hunted them, and the solution may have been something extraordinary. A moving island, a sanctuary that could never be conquered, a living fortress carrying an entire civilization on its back. Zunesha. And here is one small detail that suddenly becomes very important. In an SBS, Oda revealed that Zunesha eats giant seaweed and apples from Sky Islands. At first, that sounds like a fun, random detail, but the moment you actually think about it, it becomes extremely strange. Because Sky Islands barely have soil. Gonfall explains in Skypiea that soil is sacred because it is so rare in the sky. So where exactly are these enormous apple supplies coming from? Enough to feed a creature the size of Zunesha? The answer might be Elbaf. More specifically, the Atom Tree. And if Zunesha depends on the Atom Tree for food, that would mean the giant elephant has a direct connection to Elbaf. Which might explain something even more mysterious. why the Elbaf arc may become the place where all of these hidden connections finally come together. Because Elbaf is not just the land of giants. It might also be the place where the history of the Minks, the secrets of Zunesha, and the lost truth of the ancient kingdom finally collide. And when that happens, Carrot's story might suddenly become far more important than anyone expected. But here is where the theory becomes even stranger, because the deeper you dig into Zunesha's existence, the more it starts to feel like this giant elephant is not just a random creature wandering the seas, but the last remaining piece of something that once existed on a much larger scale. And strangely enough, the inspiration for Zunesha might actually come from the real world. The surrealist artist Salvador Dali painted several famous works featuring enormous elephants walking on impossibly long legs, while carrying massive structures and monuments on their backs. Images that symbolize impossible weight, distorted time, and the surreal nature of reality itself. And when you look at Zunesha through that lens, the idea becomes extremely interesting. Because what if Zunesha was never meant to be the only one? What if there were once many elephants like Zunesha? Imagine a world during the time of the ancient kingdom, where multiple gigantic elephants roamed the oceans, each one carrying entire civilizations on their backs, each one acting as a moving island, protecting different tribes and races from the chaos of the world. Different elephants, different tribes, different nations. And the Minks may have been only one of those civilizations. But if that world once existed, what happened to it? Why is Zunesha the only one left? One possibility is that the elephants were hunted down during the Great War that destroyed the ancient kingdom, with the world government slowly wiping them out one by one until only a single survivor remained. Zunesha, the last walking island, the last moving refuge, and the last witness of the Void Century. There is also a fascinating mythological parallel that might explain Zunesha's punishment. In some old legends, there is a story about the Wandering Jew, a man cursed with eternal life, who must wander the earth endlessly until the second coming arrives, never able to rest until the world reaches its destined moment. Whether Oda intentionally referenced this myth or not, the similarity is striking. Zunesha is a being forced to wander endlessly across the sea, carrying the history of an entire civilization on its back, waiting for the return of someone who can finally give it orders again. And when that moment arrives in Wano, something incredible happens. Zunesha hears the drums of liberation, the sound of Joy Boy returning, and immediately recognizes Luffy. Which means Zunesha is not just a giant animal. Zunesha remembers history. Zunesha remembers Joy Boy. And Zunesha may have been part of Joy Boy's final plan during the Void Century. Now imagine the moment when the ancient kingdom was attacked by the 20 kings who would later form the world government. The war was lost, the kingdom was collapsing, and in a desperate attempt to save their allies, the people of the ancient kingdom may have used the giant elephants as evacuation vessels, placing entire civilizations on their backs so they could escape destruction. The Minks may have been one of those civilizations, which would explain why Zou still carries architectural similarities to ancient structures we see in flashbacks involving Joy Boy. For example, when Emeth speaks with Joy Boy, they stand on a platform that resembles the pillar-like structures found on Zou. That visual similarity might not be random. It might be evidence that Zou preserves fragments of ancient kingdom architecture. Meaning Zou is not just a Mink homeland. Zou is a surviving piece of the lost civilization, a moving monument to the ancient kingdom. And suddenly, Carrot's role in the story becomes even more interesting. Because rabbits in storytelling have always represented something very specific. They represent the weak, the overlooked, the prey. But in many stories, rabbits eventually become something else entirely. They become the symbol of the oppressed, rising up against their hunters. In medieval tapestries, rabbits are sometimes shown overthrowing kings and predators. In Monty Python and the Holy Grail, a tiny rabbit unexpectedly massacres armored knights. In Zootopia, the small rabbit police officer proves herself capable of defeating enemies far larger than herself. And in Beastars, the white rabbit Haru represents innocence and vulnerability in a brutal world. Across cultures, rabbits often symbolize something underestimated that eventually proves far more dangerous than anyone expected. Which raises an interesting question. Why is Carrot constantly portrayed as innocent, naive, and protected? Why are the Minks trying so hard to keep her safe? Why did Oda write her story in a way that prevents her from exploring the world, even though Pedro's dream was exactly that? Unless this entire situation is just temporary. Because if the Minks are hiding something from Carrot, then eventually that secret will come out. And when it does, she will be forced to make a choice. A choice very similar to one we have seen before in One Piece. Vivi once chose to stay in Alabasta for the sake of her people. Carrot may eventually face the opposite decision. She may choose to leave Zou in order to follow Pedro's will and help bring the dawn of the world. And that moment might arrive during the Elbaf arc, because Elbaf is shaping up to become one of the most important arcs in the final saga. If the Holy Knights arrive, if the secrets of the ancient kingdom begin resurfacing, if Zunesha finally reaches the end of its 1,000-year journey, then the truth about the Minks, the Void Century, and Carrot's hidden past could all collide in the same place. And there is one final detail that might hint toward Carrot's future. In one of Oda's cover pages, we see Nekomamushi surrounded by a group of cats. At first, this seems like a simple fan request illustration, but if you count them carefully, something interesting appears. There are 13 cats, and several of them resemble members of the Straw Hat crew. Some fans believe this was Oda subtly hinting at the final number of Straw Hat pirates, 13, which means the current crew may still gain 3 more members. And many fans believe those final members could be Vivi, Carrot, and possibly one more character who has not yet joined. If that is true, then Carrot's story may not be over at all. It may simply be waiting for the right moment. The moment when the dawn finally arrives. Because if this theory is correct, then the story of the Minks is not just a side plot in One Piece. It is a hidden history stretching back to the moon. A forgotten civilization destroyed during the Void Century. A race saved by Joy Boy and protected for centuries by a giant elephant walking endlessly across the sea. Zunesha, the last living witness of the ancient kingdom. And when the final war begins, that ancient witness may finally stop walking, because the dawn of the world is finally coming.